Hello everyone, welcome to The Old Man and the Read. My name is Jerry. Today I'm going to discuss the books I've read by one of my favorite writers, Hermann Hesse. Hermann Hesse is a writer I first read back in the late 1960s, and a writer that I really became obsessed with after reading his books, and so at the time I tried to read everything I could that I could find from him, and that's actually something I've done ever since. Is when I find a writer I really like, I just try to read everything they've published. But anyway, Hermann Hesse was a German and later Swiss poet and novelist. He was born in 1877 and died in 1962. He wrote just incredibly poetic, very lyrical stories, and very interesting stories. A lot of them had to do with more Eastern philosophy type things, and a lot about spiritual journeys and those sort of subjects. But back in the late 60s, that was kind of a popular topic, and so he appealed to a lot of people like me back in my hippie days. But anyway, I'll go ahead and discuss the books I've read by him. And now I have to admit, most of these I read, over 50 years ago, and so I've had to go through and brush up. Some I have reread since, but still, most of them I couldn't really recall a lot about them, so I've had to go through and look what they were about. But I think I've got a fair idea, so I'll attempt to discuss the books now. The first book I have was published in 1904, Peter Kamenzied. And this is about a young man who's searching for his identity. And it's a subject that Hesse later wrote in several of his books. But he goes on a spiritual and intellectual journey, and ends up traveling throughout much of Europe. He explored Germany, Italy, France, and Switzerland. But anyway, it's about his search for spiritual enlightenment. In 1906, he published Beneath the Wheel. And again, this is about a young man who actually goes to seminary for an education. He excels for a period of time, but after a while the pressures become too great and he starts failing, and then is later expelled from the school. And then later he returned to his village but had difficulty adjusting back to normal life. In 1910 he published Gertrude. This is a book about a young man who was a musician and a composer. Now, he had been seriously injured in an accident when he was young and had a crippled leg. But later in life, he met a young woman named Gertrude and fell in love. Unfortunately for him, she didn't reciprocate, and she actually just considered him a good friend. But he wrote an opera and asked Gertrude to sing in it, and then also asked his best friend, Heinrich Mauth, to also sing in the opera. Now, Gertrude and Heinrich then met. They fell in love, and so the drama continued from there. In 1914, Roshold was published. And this is a story about a failed marriage between a famous artist and his wife Adele. But they they start living separate lives, but share their son Pierre. And the artist had desires to go to India, but his son, he never did that because his son was at home and he didn't want to leave him. Also in 1914, In the Old Sun was published, and this is a short little novella about 4 people that are living in a poorhouse, and one of them had been a wealthy manufacturer who went bankrupt. In 1915, Nulp was published, and this is a story about a homeless man who travels around and basically lives off of other people's generosity. In 1919, Demian was published. This follows a young man named Emil Sinclair, who's leading a very pointless life and is involved in petty crime. And then he meets Max Demian, who introduces him into a search for self-discovery and spiritual enlightenment. In 1919, Strange News from Another Star was published, and this is a collection of 8 short stories, I believe it was. In 1920, Klingsor's Last Summer was published. This particular copy has actually 3 novellas in it. 2 of them are fairly short. The first 2, A Child's Heart and Klein and Wagner. The third, Klingsor's Last Summer, is the majority of the book. And this is about an expressionist painter discussing, or in the last months of his life. In 1922, published Siddhartha. This is, I'm sure, Hesse's most well-known book, and it's actually the book I first read by him back in the late 60s that got me interested in his work. This is about a young man who leaves his home in Nepal seeking spiritual enlightenment. He travels around, becomes a beggar, and renounces all personal possessions. In his travels, he meets another man in the same situation as him, Govinda, and they travel together for a while, but then eventually part ways. Then Siddhartha crosses a river, and the ferryman who took him across was told by Siddhartha that he couldn't pay him, so the ferryman told him, was fine with it, and told him that he will be repaid some day later, in a later date. Then Siddhartha meets a young woman, a beautiful young woman, and falls in love. She tells him that she can't be with him unless he was a wealthy man, so Siddhartha goes into business and becomes a wealthy man. But then he becomes disillusioned with the luxurious life and decides to return to the life, the humble life that he had been leading. He eventually goes back to the river where the ferryman is still there and forms a relationship with him, and just then continues a very humble life. Also in 1922, Pictor's Metamorphoses was published, and this is another compilation of short stories. Some are written as fairy tales. For example, the title story, Pictor's Metamorphoses, Hesse wrote actually for the young woman that would become his second wife. Couple of the other stories I kind of enjoyed in it were Kung Yu. This is about a Chinese king who had a series of towers built to protect his kingdom, but then he made a very disastrous mistake to impress his wife. Another book that I thought was quite good was Report from Normalia, and this is about an insane asylum that grows to the size of a nation, and it's actually a metaphor for Germany, or Nazi Germany. In 1927, Steppenwolf was published. This was written during a period of time that Hesse was actually having some was dealing with some mental issues of his own, and was having suicidal thoughts. But it's about a man named Harry Haller. This is a man who's suffering from similar symptoms as Hesse, but he considers himself both man and wolf. In 1930, he published Narcissus and Goldman, and this is actually another one of my favorite books by Hesse. This is about Narcissus, who is a young teacher at a cloister school, and Goldman, who is a student. Now, the two of them are fairly close in age and become good friends. But later, Goldman meets a young girl, and he realizes that the life of a monk was not meant for him, and sets out on a wandering lifestyle, and then eventually the two of them meet up again, and that's the story there. In 1932, Hesse published Journey to the East, and I have to admit this is a very mystifying and confusing story, but it seemed to me that it was a story about Hesse's own spiritual journey for enlightenment, and basically his failure to achieve it. In 1943, he published The Glass Bead Game, and this book actually takes place in the distant future in a place called Castalia, and it's a place that's devoted to the glass bead game. And this is a game that's based on music, mathematics, and history. Kind of a confusing, doesn't really get detail on what the game is about, but it's based on that. And the story follows Joseph Knecht, who joins the order and becomes a master of the game. In 1946, he published If the War Goes On, and this is a collection of essays. The first part was written during World War I, and was reflected his attitude towards the war and Germany. The middle section was written after the war, and it's mostly about Germany in defeat and how they dealt with it. And the last part was written while he was in Switzerland, and it follows World War II, but doesn't really discuss the war in any of the essays. In 1954, he published a book, Stories of 5 Decades, and this is basically a compilation of most of the short stories he wrote throughout his life. It's a collection of 23 short stories. And finally, the last book I have to show is titled Autobiographical Writings, and this is it's a collection of short autobiographical stories of his childhood. It includes a story about his grandfather, his travels through India, and there is a long story in here about the time he spent in a spa for treatment for pain that he was having. Anyway, that's the books I've read by Hermann Hesse. Most of them I read a long time ago, but I thoroughly enjoyed his work. Just a fascinatingly good writer, fairly interesting books, stories, and just really enjoyable. Anyway, I want to thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you again on another video. Thanks.